Welcome to Casual Friday. Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is my weekly Casual Friday podcast. If you'd like to jump right to a specific point in the video, you can tap or mouse over the video playback area of your screen to reveal the chapter titles and starting points of each section. In this week's podcast, I have Tidbits, and it's Finish It February. So I'm back at work on a UFO that was giving me problems last year, my 1960s vintage sweater project. So let's get started. This first tidbit came to me in my Twitter feed. It was simply a photo of the painting I'm showing you here with the artist's name, Anders Zorn, and the year in which it was painted. There was no link, nothing else, just the painting, which as knitters, I'm sure you enjoy as much as I do, but I was a little bit curious about who this artist was and what museum might have it in its holdings. So I started Googling around, and it turns out that Anders Zorn is a Swedish artist, and he was one of the best loved and most acclaimed artists of his time. He lived from 1860 to 1920. And the article that I'm going to link to down below was in the Daily Scandinavian last October. And it mentioned that there was a museum in Denmark that was exhibiting 50 of his works. So you can see many of those images in that article that I'm linking to, as well as the image of this lovely young woman who is knitting. So this is an update from last week's tidbit about the Olympic bouquets that were being given to athletes who end up on the podium. I said, because the article that I read said this, that the bouquets were knitted. Now, when I was putting the photo in the video, when I was editing that last week, I thought, geez, those red roses look more crocheted to me, but I couldn't really get any closer in, and I couldn't see the other flowers in more detail. So I was really curious about the people who were actually knitting these bouquets, if anything was known about them, and I got articles and links to several other articles sent to me from some of you. As I was reading them, I noticed that the articles would use different terms, apparently interchangeably, to describe how these bouquets were made. Sometimes they said that they were knitted, sometimes they would say they were crochet, and there was even one article that explained how these flowers were woven together. There's also video showing these women. These are mostly women who are at senior citizens or retired people who are in various knit and crochet crafting clubs throughout the country. And you can clearly see that these people are crocheting the flowers. And yet they kept using these different words. Well, the interviews were obviously done in Mandarin, and then the articles were written and then translated into English. So I began to wonder if Mandarin was one of those languages where there aren't separate words for knit and crochet. So I started searching around, and it seems as if, and if you speak Mandarin and you know differently, please let me know down below. Knit, crochet, weave, plait, as in P-L-A-I-T, and braid all share the same word. And to me, it looks like, oh, they're using that word to describe any sort of craft where fibers are interwoven together or intermingled in some way. And just the way that it's done is different with knitting versus crochet versus weaving versus braiding, but it's still conceptually, in a big picture sense, it is, they all do fall under the same umbrella of these fibers being intermingled together, but in very different ways. So if anybody else knows more about how these different crafts are differentiated in Mandarin, or if you speak a language where the same word is used for multiple crafts like this, please let me know down in the comments below. This tidbit came to me across my Twitter feed last week, but it was too late for me to include it in last week's Casual Friday episode. It appeared in conjunction with is that World Holocaust Memorial Day is, I believe, the name of the day. And it was an article about a 110-year-old knitter who is a Holocaust survivor. And her story is very different from the woman I told you about last week, who knitted herself a sweater using the raveled yarn from German soldiers' socks. This woman was able to, with her family, leave Germany, and they ended up in China for several years, where she earned income for her family by knitting little outfits for babies and children. And then gradually they were able to get into the United States after the war. And she had a yarn shop for years. And then in later years, she worked in a friend's yarn shop after I think she sold her yarn shop. And then she worked in the yarn shop of a friend of hers until she was 105. She didn't retire until 5 years ago. So she's 110 now. She's still knitting, and I only hope that if I live to be that old, I will still be knitting as well. So I'll leave that article down below. This tidbit also showed up in my Twitter feed, I believe. It was either Twitter or Instagram. It is an artifact, a knitting artifact that is held by the Victoria and Albert Museum, and it's a handwritten book of knitting patterns, like stitch patterns. What's really cool is that there are little samples attached to the pages of this book for all of the knitting patterns except for just a handful of them. I think there's 23 patterns altogether, and 18 of them have little samples. Now, unfortunately, they only have 2 images on their website, but I will give you a link to that artifact page at the V&A Museum. So if you want to look at them more carefully and see if you can decipher the handwriting, it's pretty cool to see. I just love these old samples of knitting that are clearly meant to be a reference, a book that an individual knitter created for themselves. I love looking at really old books, particularly knitting books online. I use archive.org quite a bit. Sometimes the books I find are on Google Books. It's really fun to do that. But there's this article that showed up in my Twitter feed last week, and then another person sent it to me via direct message on Instagram, I think Nicholas. And it's an article about this guy who created a program that will allow you to search for weird old books online, but they'll only give you one result. So one of the problems with Googling or going to archive.org is that sometimes you'll get a huge number of books, and then it's kind of overwhelming and you're not sure where to start first. And in this case, it just lets you look at a weird old book, but it only gives you one. So for example, the first day that I tried this out, I typed in knitting into the search bar, and it gave me like an old copy of Ladies' Home Journal from like the 1890s or something like that. And so I looked through that, and that was pretty cool. And then today, as I was preparing for to record Casual Friday, I did it again. And this time I got a piece of sheet music from World War I. It's a song about knitting. So it's just kind of a fun little thing that you could do. And from the way I think it works is that regardless of when you search on that day, you're going to get the same book. Because I tried multiple times that first day and I always got the same book. But then when I tried a different day, I got a different book. So obviously, I'm going to leave you a link to the article that talks about the guy, Clive Thompson, who came up with this genius idea. And then you can try it out for yourself. This tidbit showed up in my Twitter feed last week, and it was posted by Isabella Rosner, who has a podcast called So What? So she is a second-year PhD student at King's College London, where she researches and writes about Quaker women's decorative arts before 1800. That's what her background is. Well, she is giving 2 talks next week, one on Wednesday, February 9th, at noon Central Time. So that would be 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern Time. And if you're in the UK, that would be 6 at night. If you're in the Central European time zone, it'll be 7 o'clock at night. The first one that's on Wednesday, February 9th is you register through Eventbrite. It is being presented by the San Francisco School of Needlework and Design, and it's about stitching through chaos. So the description is, this talk explores parallels between needlework stitched during historic moments of chaos and the COVID-19 pandemic. It draws connections between 17th century, 19th century, and contemporary embroidery, exploring the fact that needlework is and always has been an outlet for emotions ranging from frustration to joy. Isabella will analyze needlework wrought during periods of political turmoil, environmental catastrophe, widespread illness, and incarceration, mirroring the unexpected, challenging circumstances of the 2020s thus far. So this one is free, and you register through Eventbrite. I'll leave a link down below. The next one is the very next day. It's on Thursday, February 10th, same exact times, 10 o'clock Pacific, 12 noon Central, where I am, 1 p.m. Eastern, and then 6 p.m. UK, 7 p.m. in Central Europe. So this one is through the Decorative Arts Trust. This one is not, and you register through their website, and I'll leave a link down there. This one is not free, but it's pay what you can. And in this one, she will uncover the contradictions in a variety of 17th century Quaker needlework from public and private collections, and will investigate the reasons for these contradictions. 17th century needlework made by girls and women in the Society of Friends, the Quakers, is heavily opulent, which is surprising given the Society's investment in and promotion of plainness from its very beginning. So embroidering highly decorative objects with high quality materials allowed Quaker girls to learn how to use the goods produced, handled, and sold by their parents, future husbands, friends, and other members of the London Quaker community, many of whom were merchants involved in the textile trade. So these are two different topics presented by the same person 2 days in a row. So if either one of those is interesting to you, again, I'll leave links for registering for those events down in the show notes. So I've devoted a segment to preparing for Finish It February in each of the January Casual Friday podcast episodes. So if you are interested in finding ways to reduce your pile of UFOs, your unfinished objects, and if it seems a little overwhelming to you, I've got tips about how to go through that process, how to evaluate what you have, how to make decisions about whether or not you actually want to continue working on something or if you're done with it forever, and as well as how to kind of figure out how to keep your knitting interesting by rotating through projects. If you're like me and after about 3 weeks of working on the same thing, you need a break from it, then that's helpful to know. And Finish It February is an opportunity to just go find all of those things that you got tired of, but maybe you're ready to work on again. They're going to be fun once again. So I will leave links to all of the January Casual Friday podcasts. So if you want to go back and review those Finish It February segments, you can do so. If you want to do Finish It February, you want to feel like you're doing it with other people, kind of like a knit along, in my Ravelry group, I do have a discussion thread devoted to Finish It February, where you can chat about the things that are in your pile of UFOs that you're going to work on. You can show people your progress. You can post photographs of your finished objects. That's anybody who wants to chat about their UFOs is welcome to do that. I have a separate Finish It February no chat thread as well. And that thread is specifically for posting pictures of your finished or fixed items that you finish or fix in February, that it's okay for me to use in my end of the month montage of things that people finished. So if you want to know what that montage looks like, this week's Tuesday video where I did the Finish It Friday kickoff has last year's montage in it. It's about 8 minutes long, and it's set to music, and you can see all of the things that people did each week. So that I will be doing again this year. And so the second Finish It Friday thread that it says no chat is for the purposes of giving me permission to use those photos. I won't take anything from the chatty Finish It February thread at all. You don't have to worry about that. I did get a question in the comments from somebody who had gone through and looked at all of the UFOs they had, and they realized that most of the ones in their pile got put to the side because they got stuck. And they didn't know, there was maybe a technique they didn't understand, they couldn't understand the directions, or maybe they realized something went wrong and they didn't know how to get back on track or how to fix it. And so the project got put to the side. So they were wondering, how can I get help for that? Well, in my Ravelry group, people ask for help with projects all the time. I'm always happy to help people with problems with their projects, whether it's a UFO that they are working on for Finish It February, or it's just whatever their current project is, then they get stuck on it. You can go to my Ravelry group, which all of these links are down in the show notes. And you can go to my Ravelry group and you start a new discussion thread for your problem project. And you explain the problem that you're having, tell us what the name of the pattern is and who the designer is. And if you understand how to use Ravelry that way, create a link to the Ravelry pattern page. If not, as long as you have the name of the pattern and the designer, we should be able to find that link and help you out with it. So don't worry if you're not quite sure how to ask the question, just express it as best you can, and then people will come in and ask follow-up questions, and they'll help lead you through the process of figuring out what went wrong and then what your solution options are. So that's something that you can always get help with in my group at any time. I would recommend that you not use the Finish It February thread to do that, just because that's going to get lost in the chat. And in particular, I'm going to be less likely to see it. I am going through the Finish It February thread, but if you have a question and you need help with, I may not end up seeing it unless it's its own discussion thread. So all of last month, when I was telling you about Finish It February, I was also giving you updates on my 1940s vintage project. So my 1940s project is part of my long-term project to knit a sweater from each decade between the 1890s and 1990s. So on New Year's Eve, I started my 1940s project, which is a pattern called Harlequin. And like I always do, I started a spreadsheet before I cast on so I could calculate all of the stitches and how many there were going to be. And I had a pretty good idea that knitting one sleeve and the back of the sweater was going to put me obviously halfway through the sweater, but it was also going to be at the point where I was going to be kind of sick of working on the same sweater pattern and I would want to take a break. So I did the sleeve first, and you'll see the triangles are pointing up for the sleeve, and then I finished the back of the sweater where the triangles are pointing down. I finished that on January 31st. So I was able to finish this at the end of January, just in time for Finish It February. And the project that I'm going to be working on for Finish It February 1st is my 1960s vintage sweater project. So that was one where I needed breaks a couple of times during the year last year as I was knitting it, because again, it was a project that was taking me longer than 3 weeks. I did get all of the pieces knit, and then as I was seaming it together, I realized there was a problem with how the sleeve cap was fitting into the armhole. As I was diagnosing the problem and trying to figure out, what I wanted to do about it, I realized that in order to fix it in a way that I would be happy with, I was going to need to re-knit those sleeves. And after having just knit 2 of them, I didn't want to knit a 3rd and a 4th one. So I put it to the side for Finish It February. That's what I love about Finish It February. I know it's always coming up. And so if I get sick of something, if I run into a problem, if I know that, oh no, I'm going to have to rip out a whole bunch of this and I'm just mad, then I can put the sweater or whatever project it is in a timeout, knowing that I will pull everything out in February and be reminded of that project, and I will be in a better mood to work on it. So what I want to do right now is go to the overhead so I can walk you through what the problem was with my 1960s sweater, and then what I am doing to overcome those problems in order to end up with a completed sweater by the end of the month. So this is the pattern for my 1960s sweater, and when I saw this, I was really intrigued by this yoke right here and how it was done. And so I thought, well, maybe this would be the sweater I would choose for the 1960s, because that was so interesting. And what I look for in the sweater patterns that I choose for my long-term project is something that's interesting about the construction that I haven't seen before, and to try it out and see what I think of it, and if potentially I could use that construction technique in something of my own design in the future. So that was really interesting to me. But you'll see the rest of the sweater is pretty boring. It's just plain stockinette in a solid color, and that isn't very interesting at all. But I thought, well, this really made it worth it. And the other thing was that this came in a kit. It came in a vintage kit, and there was vintage yarn. I didn't end up using the yarn that came with this kit. I used yarn from a different vintage kit, but that was part of the appeal as well, is that I could actually use yarn that was from that era rather than using a contemporary yarn that was a substitute, as far as I could tell, would be a good substitute for the project, which is what I'd been doing for sweaters from 1890s to the 1930s. So I sat down and I drew a schematic, because the instructions are just all writing. There's no image at all in here for what the sweater looks like. One of the nice things was that it did come in, the instructions were written for multiple sizes. This was the first time that I'd used a vintage or antique pattern that did have instructions for multiple sizes rather than one size that I had to modify in order to fit me. So that was interesting as well for me to see how this was presented, but I did need a schematic because I wanted to understand what was going on before I made a decision about knitting the sweater. I drew a schematic based on the instructions, and they tell you how many stitches to cast on, and then they tell you what the gauge is, so you can figure out how big something actually is in terms of width or length based on that information. So I could see that the basic sweater was knit like this, and this was really interesting to me, that this sleeve, the armhole, seemed like a hybrid between what I would consider a set-in sleeve and a raglan sleeve. So you have this, what looks very much like a raglan line going up for about a third or so of the depth of the armhole, and then it just goes straight up. And I thought, well, that's really interesting. And then I drew out the sleeve. So the sleeve has the same angle right here that the body has. So you're matching things up along here. And for both the body and the sleeve, they were placing the decreases 2 stitches or 3 stitches in from the edge. So the first 2 stitches would be stockinette, and then you'd work together the 3rd and 4th stitches. And you would do that on the sleeve as well as on the body. So when those are seamed together, you get that kind of wide line where you have a defined line of decreases. And then what happens is that the decreases shift to being actually in the selvage. I had never seen that before, where a pattern specified placing some of the decreases away from the edge and then saying to place others in the edge. Whenever I looked at older patterns, or like the patterns that I was knitting from in like the 80s and 90s, if a pattern said do a decrease at the beginning and end of a row, I always did it at the beginning in the first 2 and the last 2 stitches. And then as I went through the master hand knitting program, I learned that it's best to place them away from the edge so that you can leave that selvage stitch available for really nice seaming. So this was something I'd never encountered, where it did specify away from the edge, but then said put it in the edge. And I thought, well, that's really interesting. I wonder what that is going to look like. So this sleeve cap and armhole situation was another reason that I thought the construction of this sweater was really interesting. So when I went to seam the sleeve in, you can see on this side, the left edge of the sleeve cap, it seamed in just fine. But when I looked at this side, it was all kind of puckered up. And I wasn't sure what the issue was. I took it out and seamed it in a couple of times. And eventually I decided that the issue was probably when I was knitting this, I was using my continental knitting style on circular needles. And while I can get, very good tension over the main part of the fabric, I do tend, when I'm knitting in continental, and this is just me, that my right selvage tends to be looser. And so I thought that this might indicate an issue with the edge of the fabric being looser, and therefore being wider, and then causing this to kind of pucker like that, because it was the same number of decreases and same number of rows on this side, which was perfectly smooth. Then I had a second issue, which was I knit the sleeve caps starting from the base and knitting them up just as the instructions called for, but I started with a provisional cast on so that I could knit the rest of the sleeve top down, because I was concerned about the amount of yarn I had, if I had enough to actually complete the sleeves. So I wanted to knit the cap as it was instructed, and then I knit the sleeve top down. And what I noticed was, as I moved down the sleeve, it was the summertime, my hands were swollen, and when I'm knitting with fingering weight yarn on small needles in the summertime with swollen hands, my gauge shifts. And so at the bottom of the sleeve, my gauge was like 7 stitches per inch instead of 7.5. So I had the right gauge up here, but I had selvage stitches that were maybe too loose. And then I didn't like the bottom of the sleeves because the gauge was looser, and which resulted in a slightly bigger sleeve. And then I just didn't like it. So I thought I'm going to reknit these sleeves. So the way that I am dealing with that selvage stitch is to not knit using my continental knitting style on circular needles, but instead I'm knitting on long straight needles and using my English method, my throwing method of knitting, because when I use that method, I get very good selvages on the right edge, and they're perfect. I just tend to these days prefer my continental knitting style for most things, and I prefer using circular needles, but I will use a different method if I need a very specific result that I can only get with my throwing method. So I'm reknitting this sleeve cap, and I've got a very nice selvage over here. And I am hoping that that is going to work. Another change that I might make that I didn't want to do when I knit the sleeves the first time is I might end up knitting them to be 3/4 length just to get this project over with. I don't tend to like 3/4 length sleeves, but I might prefer finishing this thing and having 3/4 length sleeves to making full length sleeves and getting really fed up with it. So I did have one other issue. I knit the first sleeve cap, and I realized that I had knit this 1 stitch in from the edge. So instead of knitting 2 stitches and then doing the decreases, I knit 1 and then did it. And I did try seaming this in. It's better than what I had before, but I wanted to make a couple of other tweaks to the shaping of the sleeve cap just to make a completely smooth just to get the best result that I could. So I knit all this early in the week, and I will probably end up ripping this out, but I'm not going to rip this out until I finish this one, which I did use fewer stitches here, and I slightly adjusted some of the decrease rate a bit. And if this one works out better, I'm going to sew this one into one of the armholes, and if that works really well, and I'm happy with that, then I will continue on with this plan. And then I will rip this one out. So there's a lot of ripping out with this sweater that seemed like it should be pretty straightforward, given that it's all stockinette. I resisted the urge to completely redraft a sleeve cap using modern methods, because I really wanted to stay true to the 1960s process. And if it still doesn't turn out as well as I would like, that tells me something about that style of sleeve cap. It tells me, well, this is not a technique that I would want to use going forward in contemporary designs. But if it works out well, then I want to know that. And I want to know if the adjustments that I made would make a difference or not. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you really enjoy my videos, please consider subscribing. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.